Beyond my own interest in Indian politics, I felt a responsibility to give you this story because I think it is the biggest story happening in the world right now. On Tuesday, December 8th, 250 million Indians took part in a general strike. It is believed to be the largest strike in human history. It's in response to when the right-wing government of Narendra Modi rammed through these corporate-friendly laws through parliament. The laws most strongly affect rural people, and so what happened was a couple months ago in Punjab and Haryana, farmers started to uprise and they started these demonstrations, and they've gained so much steam that they've been joined by, are you ready for this list? 450 farmers' unions and organizations, student activists, industrial and transportation workers, women's rights organizations, domestic servants, and civil society groups. The general strike has shut down shops, markets, public transit, and when I say it's locked down transit, India's capital city of Delhi has a few arteries that go in and out of the city, and hundreds of thousands of farmers sat down and said, nothing's getting in or out of here. Police, as you can see from some of the B-roll, this is all courtesy of Democracy Now!, police have responded in the typical police ways of water cannoning people and doing anything they can to break up peaceful protests in a democracy. Anyway. I find it flat out amazing that 250 million people got together to do anything. Look, there's no sugarcoating the horrible suffering and circumstances that forced 250 million people to actually get out in the streets, but it's just wonderfully inspiring to see this kind of a reaction, to see 250 million people standing up for a better life. So I wanted to put 250 million into context because this is a giant fucking number. So I do what I always do when I want to put something into context, which is compare it to baseball. So 250 million people is like taking 5,952 baseball stadiums and packing them into capacity. I remember being impressed when I went to a couple protests earlier in 2020 in my town where 2,000 people showed up for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was super impressed because 2.5% of our city showing up and doing something. That's amazing. In India, with these general strikes, 250 million people equals 1 in 4 people between the ages of 15 and 64. So it's newsworthy that this many people are doing anything. The suffering that they're going through that led to this is newsworthy. But the reason why this is, in my view, the most important story in the world is because the Indian government is a right-wing government. It's not responsive to the people. It's responsive to the corporations in India. And so what these strikers are doing is they're shutting down the economy and they're hurting corporations in the way that they can. Because the only way that they're going to get change is by hurting the people that Narendra Modi and the rest of his BJP listen to. Okay, so most important question, what do they want? What is the point of these strikes? A repeal of anti-worker laws passed a few months ago, direct cash payments, and food to the needy, higher wages, stopping the wave of privatization by the Modi government, a repeal of laws forcing early retirement for government workers, and pensions for all. I want to present to you the broader context of what's happening in India, because is it ever just one thing that causes 250 million people to get out in the streets? I was going to do my classic Keegan thing of just throwing a bunch of numbers in order to describe the problem. The richest 1% of India's population hoards 73% of the country's wealth, while the poorest 2/3 own only 1% of the country's wealth. But I think it's best summed up by a question asked by Democracy Now!'s Narmeen Sheikh.
Talk about these protests in the wider economic context in India. Unemployment is now at 27%, which is unprecedented in the country. As we mentioned earlier, almost 60% of India's 1.3 billion people rely on agriculture as their main source of livelihood. In just 2 years, from 2018 to 2019, over 20,000 farmers died by suicide. Meanwhile, a billionaire, the richest man in India, Mukesh Ambani, has made $12 million an hour since the lockdown began as a result of the pandemic in March. Could you talk about the broader context of these protests?
I wish that was how journalism was taught in journalism school. If you want straight news, I cannot recommend Democracy Now! More. That's the kind of question you will get on a regular basis with them. The primary reason I love Narmeen Sheikh's question there so much is because her question in and of itself expands my understanding of what's happening in India. She doesn't even need an interesting or informative guest. Fortunately, they did have an interesting guest. He's a very prominent voice in India. Here's some good information he has to share.
New papers, studies showing us 76% of the rural population, that is 3/4 of the rural population, cannot afford a nutritious meal. They cannot afford a basic nutritious diet. Even if, say, all rural Indians spent 100% of their income on food and nothing else, no transport, health, education, rent, they didn't spend anything of that, it would still mean 63.3% cannot afford a nutritious diet if they spent every last paisa they earned. India ranks 4th or 5th in the list of dollar billionaires in the world and 129th on the UN Human Development Index.
So let's talk about Narendra Modi's government. He's the Prime Minister of India. He's a member of the RSS, which is the Hindu nationalist Indian KKK, essentially. He leads the BJP, and they are a right-wing, corporatist, Hindu nationalist party. Under Modi, there has been a giant wave of privatization and a massive transfer of wealth from India's poor population to India's billionaires. The Modi government with these laws is essentially price gouging its own people, and it's using the argument of, we're going to update our farming system and allow farmers more power over their crop prices. My imitation of Indian officials sounds a lot like a pharmaceutical commercial. But basically their argument is something familiar to Americans, that deregulation equals freedom. I'm going to do another video debunking the fantasy that deregulation equals freedom. But essentially the BJP, again, that's the political party in power in India, their strategy is essentially to lie to farmers, dismiss their concerns, and then pretend the strike is some conspiracy by the opposition.
To understand one very important thing about the protests, and for that you need to understand what kind of mischief was played in the laws. 3 major laws have been passed in Parliament which devastate the farmers, and you mentioned them as you introduced the subject. 2 days later, when the opposition walked out in protest, they rammed through 4 labor laws codifying 29 existing complex legislations and made them into 4 and rammed it through. Now the question is, why did they feel the need to pass these laws at the height of the pandemic? Mr. Modi had a majority before the pandemic. He has a big majority. He will have it for 2-3 years after the pandemic. The reasoning was, these blokes are on their knees now. They can't organize. They can't hit back. And in fact, many leading neoliberal intellectuals, economists, and journalists, editors, incited the government, saying, never waste a good crisis. This is the time to ram through aggressive next generation reforms. And the government, believing that, went for this action, not understanding the resolve of these farmers who have come back massively at the government.
One of the other things the BJP has done is they placed the Delhi chief minister, they placed him under house arrest for having the audacity to want to join these protests. You know, because democracy. I was curious to see if in any way this was not economic. I have a major bias towards thinking of everything in terms of people's material needs, so I wanted to kind of break out of my own bias, and I wanted to examine if this is in any way religiously motivated. There are massive religious tensions happening in India. There was just horrible, horrible things happening in the state of Kashmir. And so I wanted to look at the religious demographics of the states that started these demonstrations. Punjab is majority Sikh, and the rest of it's largely Hindu, and then Haryana is massive majority of Hindus. So this has nothing to do with religious unrest. This is all to do with people's material needs. Support this weird political channel by liking this video and clicking subscribe. This is Alien Perspective. Thanks for watching.